Good morning, everyone. I've got about 11 o'clock, and so we'll start our webinar and give folks a few moments to join. This is our first time, or my first time, using the Zoom platform to host a webinar. So far it seems to be going well. I've got my other screen here, and I don't have 20 emails from frustrated people trying to log in, so I'm taking that as a positive right now. But this is our first webinar in a series that we're going to offer this year from our leadership, volunteerism, and community engagement program team. So this is a program team within Extension that focuses on those issues. We're going to work on getting some more webinars set up, and we will send out a schedule so that you can join us. But we really appreciate everyone coming and joining today. Just a couple of notes. If you have questions, please put those in the chat pod, and we will field those at a couple of different stopping points through Michelle's presentation today. The session is being recorded, so Dave, Bill, be on your best behavior. Now we'll have this as a documented record if we need it. But really do appreciate everyone joining. Today we have Michelle Prysby, Director of the Master Naturalist program, joining us. And Michelle comes to us with a long history of volunteer management and working with volunteer programs. But you know, the truth is she manages I see that, Dave. Michelle manages one of the most vibrant programs in the state within Extension, the Master Naturalist program. And so really happy to have her. She's very, very involved with all of their programming, and going to talk to us a little bit about volunteer retention and recognition, something that we always want to be thinking about, even crosses so many boundaries for what we do. Thank you, Bill. I'm glad to see that you're going to try. Is that in quotation marks? But really, as we go, please, if you have questions, do go ahead and put them into the chat pod and let us know. I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn that over to Michelle so that she can tell you all about volunteer retention and engagement.
All righty, so I think I'm sharing my screen now. Yep, okay. So hi everybody, welcome, thanks for joining us today. Our intention with this program team's series of webinars is to make these fairly short, like 30 minutes long, so it's something that you can fit into your day more easily. And it is being recorded, as John said, so that folks who aren't here can watch it later, or if you want to just go back and check something out, you can. I want to start by saying one thing I like about the VCE program teams, and this one, the Leadership, Volunteerism, and Civic Engagement program team specifically, is that it provides recognition that volunteer management is itself a research-based field. So I think that managing volunteers is something that so many of us in Virginia Cooperative Extension do, but we don't have a department for it the way we have horticulture or entomology or things like that. So it seems like there isn't research basis behind it and real content, but there is. There's a vast amount of literature on volunteer management out there. And so I think the more that we can recognize that this is an area where we can all develop skills, have professional development, read to learn best practices, the better we're off. So, okay, I'm excited to talk about volunteer retention and engagement specifically today. I should start with a caveat that it's not like I have some magic solution. So our volunteer retention within the Virginia Master Naturalist program certainly can use some improvement. I would love to have those outcomes be even higher than what they are. But I still have some tips to share with you today based on literature and experience. So the first thing to talk about as we're getting started is, what do we even mean by volunteer retention? That's an important thing to think about from the beginning, because I think that sometimes in VCE, we have volunteer roles that are just indefinite, like there's no end time on them. And so then it's very difficult to understand how you're doing with volunteer retention. So volunteer retention is keeping volunteers for the amount of time for which they committed at the start of their service. So that's an important thing to identify when you're recruiting and screening volunteers, is what is the expected commitment. And it should not be forever, because that's not really fair. Nobody can make a commitment to forever. In the case of the Virginia Master Naturalist program, our kind of first level of commitment is that a volunteer will stay after their initial basic training to complete the first 40 hours of volunteer service and 8 hours of continuing education, which gives them the title of Certified Virginia Master Naturalist. We'd love for volunteers to stick around longer than that and kind of depend on volunteers staying longer than that. But if we can retain a volunteer so that they complete that first round of service to reach the Certified Virginia Master Naturalist status, I consider that a real success. It's also important to think about engagement. So retention, keeping the volunteers around, engagement is reflecting the nature and the level of that involvement. And here's a graphic that I find useful to think about. The source is on the bottom of the screen there, and it's looking at volunteer engagement. This was kind of from the perspective of a nonprofit organization that might have members, but I think it applies to a lot of what we do. So on the horizontal here is a continuation of how connected the volunteer is to the organization. And on the vertical axis here is the amount of commitment. So you might have volunteers who are on your books as belonging, but aren't doing very much. So they have kind of low connection and low commitment. And then as their connection and commitment grows, they might be considered more of an engaged volunteer. So maybe they're coming to trainings, they're continuing to learn more. And then this is kind of a sweet spot here, is those active folks, people who are applying what they have learned. Again, increasing that connection and commitment. And over time, you might have some of these volunteers grow into real partners, in that certain things that you do in VCE cannot succeed without those people. So they're kind of critical to your organization, a high level of commitment, high level of connection. But one thing I think is useful for me to think about here is that in the Master Naturalist program, and I think this might be true in some of what you do too, we might have volunteers who do not meet that description of volunteer retention that I just said, that completing the 40 hours of volunteer service, but are very engaged. So we have volunteers who have been active in the program for years, doing only 20 hours of service every year, but they're really consistent about being involved in the things that they're involved in. So I would say that they're very engaged volunteers, even if they haven't met that retention expectation that I talked about. Just a couple of volunteerism trends that I think it's useful to know about. Overall, nationally, the rate of volunteerism seems to be on a bit of a decline, although the most recent data that I could find was from 2015 and earlier. But as of 2015, about 25% of Americans reported that they were volunteering in some way. The good news is that the volunteerism is actually trending upwards in Virginia. So it's higher than the national average, more like 30%. And it also was seeming to go up in recent years rather than going down in recent years as it was nationally. But both nationally and in Virginia, the retention rate was about 2/3. So 66% roughly of volunteers who volunteer one year volunteer the next. Or another way to think about it is 1 in 3 volunteers who volunteers one year does not volunteer the next year. So there are some costs to this kind of turnover, right? Some that I could think of are the time and the money that it takes to recruit and train new volunteers to replace those who may have left. When you have volunteers who don't stay for a long time, it might be hard to find those volunteers who can take on leadership roles because it's harder to convince people to take on a leadership when they're brand new to a program or activity or organization. You might have a lack of volunteers who can take on activities that require more experience. So just taking the Master Gardener help desks, for example, I know that at least in the county where I'm physically based in Albemarle, all the new Master Gardener interns have to do a shift on the help desk, but they're always paired with an experienced person so that there's somebody there who really knows how things work. And if you don't have good volunteer retention, you won't have those experienced people to serve in those roles. And sometimes if you don't have good volunteer retention outcomes, you might just have to discontinue some of your activities or programs that really rely on volunteers. I do want to point out, however, though, that there are some benefits associated with volunteer turnover. So I don't really think that like 100% retention of volunteers forever is it's not only not a practical goal, but I'm not even sure it's a great goal because there are benefits to getting new people involved. So just bringing in new ideas, new energy, keeping programs from becoming stale because the same person has been running it for years and years and years. We as managers can become complacent when the same people have been doing the same thing for years. And so we maybe stop providing them with as much active support because we figure, oh, they just know what they're doing now. So there really are some benefits to having a little bit of volunteer turnover. So in looking at the literature, there are 3 volunteer management practices that I wanted to highlight today that are tied to increasing volunteer retention. And I'll say a little bit more about each one of these. One of them is screening volunteers to match them to volunteer roles and activities. One is providing training and professional development, and one is recognition. So I'll say a little bit more about each one of these. So in terms of the screening volunteers to help make a match, I think in VCE, we say screening, and we pretty much all are thinking, oh, background checks, enrollment forms, that's screening. And that is one piece of screening. But another important piece of screening is trying to get information to help make sure there's a good match between the prospective volunteer and the volunteer role that is available to them. And there are some different ways to go about that. One useful principle that I like to think about is comes from this researcher, Ivan Shear. And he has this idea that you should make the minimum difference in what a person wants to do and what they can do in order to have the maximum positive impact on other people. Or in other words, you basically want as close a match as possible between what a volunteer wants to do and what they are able to do, what they can do. So how do you figure that out as part of the screening process? Well, you have to ask some questions, and these might be as part of your application form, or they might be something that you do in the interview process. And these are things that are, you know, both aspects, the application and the interview, are things that would happen in our master volunteer programs, and probably I would assume in 4-H, where you have a longer term kind of volunteer role. You may not always be doing interviews if you're just getting some warm body type volunteers for one event, kind of an episodic sort of thing. But questions, ways to get about this, just asking, why do you want to become a volunteer in this program? And one tip that I got was, especially if you were doing this on an application form, is to say, give 3 reasons, not just ask, why do you want to become a volunteer in this program, but ask for 3 reasons why, because that'll encourage people to dig a little bit deeper. I think we find, like in the Master Naturalist program, for example, just asking that question on its own, people are going to frequently say something like, I want to learn more about the environment. I want to help the environment. And it tells you something, but if you ask for 3 reasons, people might get a little bit more detailed and dig a little bit deeper into their motivations. Other ways to kind of ask that question: what do you hope to gain from your participation? What drew you to this program or opportunity in the first place? Sitting down, here's a list of some of the activities volunteers do in this program. Which ones do you think you'd be interested in and why? Which ones do you think you would really not want to do and why? Really helpful to get that information from the get-go. And then kind of thinking about that retention definition that we talked about, keeping a volunteer around to fulfill the commitment that they originally committed to. We often don't ask, but how long do you expect to be an active volunteer with this program? So those are all things that you would want to do in the screening process to get that information so that you can hopefully make sure that this volunteer is going to be well matched to the opportunities available. Then you can continue doing more of this as volunteers go through the training process. And I know through Master Gardeners and Master Food Volunteers and Master Naturalists, volunteers all go through an extensive training process. Also, I think that is the case for many of the 4-H roles as well. So one thing I like to do when I have the opportunity with our Master Naturalist chapters around the state is this activity called Choosing the Perfect Volunteer Opportunity. And I do that kind of towards the end of their basic training course, sometimes when I'm invited to speak. And it's basically a real simple activity that is designed to help new volunteers become more self-aware of what their volunteering motivations are, and then to start that process of really matching them to the opportunities that are available. This is important in a program like Master Naturalists and Master Gardeners because during the training portion, although the Master Naturalists can start volunteering at any time during their training, but most of them don't do too much until after their training portion is over. And then there's kind of a disconnect because in the training, they're told exactly where to be and when. Like, okay, show up Tuesday nights for 2 hours, and if you do that, you're going to complete the training requirement. And then we kind of turn them loose after that and say, here's an entire buffet of things you can do as a Master Naturalist volunteer now that you have finish the training, and it's up to them to decide which ones they want to do and figure out where to be in order to participate in that activity. So there's a lot less hand-holding through that part, and I find that this activity can kind of help bridge that gap. So I'm actually going to bring up another document here. Hang on a second. So this is the lesson plan that I was referring to, Choosing the Perfect Volunteer Opportunity. I got this from a colleague of mine, Nate Meyer, who's with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I'd be happy to email it around to anybody who would like it afterwards, or if John ends up having any idea how to actually post a document into a Zoom so that you guys can download it, we can do that too, but I'm also fine emailing it. But anyway, this activity involves having volunteers think about their things that they like to give. He calls them glad gives, but it's basically like, what would you do? What do you like to do that is no work for you, that you would gladly offer to anybody? And then identifying what are your needs and how those might match up. So in the end of the activity, I'll just kind of skip to the end of it, volunteers work through this matrix where they sit down and they have a block for desire. What do I like doing? I'll just use a Master Naturalist example here. Maybe somebody would put, I really like watching birds. Ability, what do you have to offer? And this might not just be personal skills, but it might be other sorts of resources. Well, I have a big, huge property that has lots of birds on it. I have the ability to build bird houses. I have, you know, whatever other skills and resources they think might relate. Then the next column here is need. What I need in order to do that thing that I like to do. So I love watching birds. I need to know how to identify the birds in my area better, might be an example. And then this column is the really important one, is linking. How what I like doing can help others. And this is where I would have the Master Naturalist volunteers in the chapter help this new trainee figure out what projects that are going on in the chapter or could be going on in the chapter relate to that desire. Oh, okay, well, we do a Christmas bird count. We do this bird education thing in the summer at a 4-H camp with youth, whatever it might be. But that kind of requires the experienced volunteers to jump in and say, hey, I recognize your desire. Here are some things that it links to. And then also important is identifying those contacts. So where that trainee needs to go next in order to get involved with that particular activity. So I like to use this as a way to really bridge that gap between the training and the volunteering, and to learn more about what are those desires, those motivations of the volunteers in order to make a good match between what they can do and what they would like to do. So let me go back to my slideshow here. Okay, so that was that whole section was about creating that match through screening and ongoing talking to volunteers, the match between what they want to do and what they can do. The next thing that is shown in the research to be related to higher volunteer retention rates is providing training and professional development. And I think that our programs probably do this pretty well, for sure in the beginning, but in order to keep retaining volunteers, it's something that you want to continue providing throughout the volunteer life cycle. So continue providing those training opportunities and professional development opportunities. And think about including, some that are only for those volunteers, right? So things that are not open to other members of the public, but things that are only available to them because they are a 4-H volunteer, because they are a Master Gardener volunteer, etc. And then link back to those motivational questions on the application or in the interview. What was it specifically that the volunteers wanted to learn about? What skills did they hope to gain through their volunteer role? Are there additional trainings that you can provide that get at helping the volunteers meet those motivations? And then the third category is providing recognition in a diversity of ways. So there were a couple of researchers that looked at motivations for human behavior and divided them into 3 major categories. So one was those motivated by achievement. And those folks tend to be goal-oriented, looking to improve their skills and performance, and maybe looking to achieve a certification or ranking or title, like Certified Virginia Master Naturalist. The second category is those motivated by affiliation, and those folks tend to value being part of a group that they respect. They tend to value relationships, enjoy the sense of belonging, enjoy working with others. They tend to be motivated by a sense of wanting to feel helpful. And then those motivated by influence tend to be volunteering because they want to bring about change in the world. So they're volunteering because they want to solve hunger in their community. They want to make a difference in youth leadership, for example. They tend to want to influence people and events. So keeping these sorts of motivations in mind is helpful when you're thinking about volunteer recognition, because people who are motivated in these different categories appreciate different types of recognition. And some you see lots of variability here. So again, these are generalizations, but people who are involved in a volunteer opportunity mainly out of an achievement motivation tend to like recognition, tangible recognition items like pins, certificates, seeing their volunteer statistics, receiving awards. You know, we in the Master Naturalist program, just as an example, we give these special little pins to each year to anybody who has achieved the certified Virginia Master Naturalist status. And it's a different pin each year, and you only get that pin if you got to that status. So it's definitely like a mark of achievement. On the other hand, people who are more motivated by affiliation tend to appreciate personal letters thanking them, or personal letters that tell them about the impacts of what they have done. They like to be recognized in front of their family and peers. They tend to like identifying items that show that they're part of a group, like a t-shirt that shows that they're part of the organization, invitations to social occasions, invitations to group projects. And then in the influence category, those folks tend to appreciate opportunities to make a difference, opportunities to innovate the practices of the organization, to take on leadership roles, the opportunity to interact with other influencers. So what we find is that it's useful to have, if you have a group of volunteers who may all be different in this regard, it's useful to use lots of different kinds of recognition. So those who, not everybody is motivated by pins. We sometimes hear from Master Naturalists, for example, who are like, I don't care about getting that pin at all. And then we hear from volunteers who are like, I have to get in my last hour of service because if I don't get the oyster pin this year, I'm gonna be very upset. So just keep in mind that not everybody's the same on that, and use that information to make a recognition plan. So what is your plan for recognizing volunteers in your organization? And that plan should include day-to-day recognition. And that can be as simple as saying thank you. I mean, I will be honest, I try to make it a habit to, every email I have to a volunteer, I always try to start and end with a thank you. You know, thank you for what you're doing, both at the beginning and the end, because I think we cannot say that enough. Your recognition plan should also include planned recognition activities and events. And then you should think about tailoring that recognition to fit the motivations of the volunteers, like we just talked about. Some other factors to consider that are related to increasing volunteer retention: allocating funds to support volunteers. So charitable organizations that felt like they did not have any resources to use on supporting volunteers tended to have lower volunteer retention. Having an organizational culture that welcomes and encourages volunteers also increases retention, not surprisingly, but I think that that's something we should all be aware of in our interactions in our extension offices and the way that we speak. I think on the sly, those of us who are managing volunteers sometimes roll our eyes. Oh, volunteers, they can be so difficult. But you know, we want to be careful to not promote an organizational culture that seems dismissive of volunteers when they are so important to our organization. And kind of related to that, organizations that placed a higher value on volunteers tended to have higher retention. So for example, communicating the fact that we would not have help desks for the public to call to get their horticultural questions answered if we did not have Master Gardener volunteers, for example. So there is an extremely high value placed on that volunteer service. And then interestingly, another factor that was associated with higher retention was involving volunteers in recruiting other volunteers. And the speculation was that that might be related to having those volunteers feel like they're a trusted part of the organization. And if you have volunteers who don't stay, try to learn why. So maybe it's exit interviews, maybe it's occasional surveys, or talking to people informally, but try to keep track of why people don't stick around so that you can know if a pattern emerges. Maybe it's just all that people have different life circumstances, and so that changes their availability. But you might notice other patterns that lead to something that you want to change in your management strategy. So 11:30, I think I hit that timing on the nose, but I'm not really done, because what I would like to do now is have a chance for you all to share your ideas and experiences related to volunteer engagement and retention, as well as questions. So feel free to use the chat box here, and we'll see what we can find. So what great successes have you had with volunteer retention strategies? Or what questions do you have? I'll just give folks a second here. Thanks, Stephanie. Oh yes, I agree. John says it'd be fine to speak if you'd rather not type. We're a small enough group that I don't think that that's a problem. And Molly says we have general recognition, but she's saying that she really appreciates getting a handwritten note from a leader in the group. And I think that that's a great point. That thank yous, I feel like, are totally rated. And our Master Naturalist chapters, for example, are often trying to think of these great gifts to give to speakers, the guest instructors who come teach their basic training classes. You know, oh, are we going to give them a mug? Are we going to give them a book? What are we going to give them? And I say, I teach classes for them all the time, and I'm like, do not underestimate just simply writing a really nice thank you. I value that every bit as much, if not more, than getting some item. And if folks ever want to get in touch with me, somebody asks about getting in touch for some one-on-one questions, I've just put my email address in the chat box, as well as my phone number. And I'm always happy to talk with anybody. Yeah, I agree. Somebody put that we get caught up in being busy and leave out the recognition piece. And that's absolutely true. So I think take time to make that plan, especially for the what are you going to do on a day-to-day basis, so that you can just start making that part of something that you do regularly. And then you can add in the bigger things like a volunteer thank you event, or a volunteer gift, whatever it is. Oh, okay, so somebody put, I think another form of recognition is having a specific task for each volunteer. Do you want to unmute yourself and tell us more about what you're thinking on that one? I'm interested to hear. Or type it, either way. Oh, got it. Okay. They're going to put it in the chat box because they're in a cube.
And Michelle, while that's getting typed in, I saw Eric had asked about sharing the presentation. Is that something that you're able to do, and we could post that along with the PDF?
Absolutely. I am happy to share the presentation, and I can, and any other associated documents that folks want to have. So John and I can figure out the best way to do that. Ooh, that's a super interesting question. Some volunteers follow the agent who trained them. When the agent leaves, they want to leave also. How can you retain them as the new agent? You know, that's such a great question, because that personal relationship is super helpful in terms of volunteer retention, and really, you know, getting to know somebody as an individual, and having that personal relationship. But yeah, when that person leaves, then that personal relationship is broken, and that volunteer may no longer feel connected to the organization. So I haven't gotten that question before, and I don't have a great answer for you off the top of my head. But I think it's a really good thing to be aware of. Does anybody else have a particular idea on that front? Okay, yeah, getting the old agent to make an introduction.
I agree with that. I think that's a good comment, and I'll weigh in just briefly, because, you know, we see this, of course, in the Extension Master Gardener program with turnover, and you know, I really believe one of the key tenets is it's all based on relationships, and so that introduction is an important part to start with, and then it's about them getting to know you and know what your interests are, and you getting to know them, and not necessarily having an expectation on either side about who's going to be doing what. You know, I think it's more about building that relationship, and I see, yeah, Molly, I agree, and so that would be, you know, my first piece of advice there is to start with the introduction and tell them about yourself and why you're there and what you're, you know, just kind of how you feel about that position.
Yeah, that's really good. And now I understand the previous comment, and that is 100% true. Do not recruit volunteers if you do not have something for them to do. That's like number one in volunteer management, because people will quickly grow bored and feel like they're not needed. Boredom is a much more likely reason for somebody to leave a volunteer opportunity or volunteer role than feeling overworked, actually. So you definitely want to have things ready to go when you have volunteers coming on board. And mentoring is a great idea. I know that a lot of our master volunteer programs do that in various ways. Have an experienced person help the new trainee be connected.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in the master programs, you know, the training time is long, and the sooner that we can get volunteers working on a task or on a project that they like and feel involved with, you know, that's a big part of why they're there, is to do that volunteer part. They like the training part as well, but, you know, getting them engaged and involved early on, even while the training's still happening, I think helps a lot with retention.
Yeah, some of our Master Naturalist chapters have actually made it a graduation requirement to have volunteers have to complete 1 or 2 hours of volunteer service and accurately report it in our volunteer management system, so that they can show that they know how to use that system before they leave, and that they've, you know, successfully crossed the hurdle of doing a volunteer thing and reporting it in there.